The history books you read in school told you about one kind of slavery. They showed you plantations, cotton fields, and the Atlantic, and those stories are real, and they matter. But there is another chapter, older, darker, and almost completely erased from the modern curriculum. A chapter set along the sun-baked shores of North Africa, in the markets of Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli. A chapter where European women were stripped, inspected, and sold. Where men were mutilated to serve in palaces. Where children vanished into harems and were never seen again. This is the story of Barbary slavery. And what happened behind closed doors was something historians have only recently begun to fully document. Stay with me, because this story deserves to be told completely. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, the North African states of Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and Morocco, collectively known as the Barbary states, operated one of the most sophisticated slave trading enterprises the world had ever seen. And unlike the Atlantic slave trade, which targeted Africans from sub-Saharan regions, the Barbary slavers had a very specific preference: Europeans, white-skinned, blue-eyed, fair-haired Europeans, particularly women. The Corsairs, or Barbary pirates, were state-sponsored raiders. They weren't rogue criminals. They operated with the blessing of local rulers and the Ottoman Empire, and they were extraordinarily good at what they did. Their ships were fast, their networks were vast, and their reach was terrifying. At the peak of their power, roughly 1580 to 1680, Barbary Corsairs raided coastlines as far north as Iceland. In 1627, they descended on the Westman Islands off Iceland's southern coast and took over 400 people captive. The raid is still remembered in Icelandic history as the Turkish abduction. They raided Ireland, they raided Cornwall, they struck villages in southern Italy and Spain so frequently that entire coastal communities were abandoned for centuries. Historian Robert Davis, in his landmark study, Christian Slaves, Muslim Masters, estimated that between 1 million and 1.25 million Europeans were enslaved by Barbary raiders between 1500 and 1800. 1 million Europeans, forgotten. When a Corsair ship returned to port with its human cargo, the process that followed was methodical, bureaucratic, and deeply degrading. Captives were first taken to what was called the bagnio, a large holding facility that functioned like a combination of prison and processing center. Here, they were sorted. Men who appeared strong were evaluated for labor, quarries, oars, construction. Men who appeared educated or skilled, doctors, engineers, translators, were sometimes ransomed or put to specialized use. But women were evaluated differently. Women were inspected by merchants and agents in ways that contemporary accounts describe as clinical and humiliating. Their teeth were examined, their skin was assessed, their age was estimated, and their physical attributes were ranked according to a market value system that was well established and openly discussed in merchant correspondence. Young women, teenagers in many cases, commanded the highest prices. A Venetian merchant writing in the 17th century described watching a sale in Algiers, where a group of captured Italian women were paraded before buyers. He wrote that the process was conducted as one inspects livestock before purchase, with buyers openly discussing the women's value in terms of their suitability for domestic or private use. Private use. That phrase was the polite language of the era. What it meant was not polite at all. This is the section that history class never taught you. The women purchased at Barbary markets entered one of several fates, and almost all of them involved a complete loss of autonomy over their own bodies. The most desirable women, by the brutal standards of this market, were purchased for entry into private households or royal palaces as concubines. This was not a metaphor, it was a legal institution. Under the system operating in these states, a slaveholder had legal rights over a female slave that extended to intimate coercion. Women who entered these households had no legal recourse, no ability to refuse, and no path to freedom except through the decision of the man who owned them. European women were particularly sought after because of their physical appearance, and because owning a fair-skinned European woman was a status symbol among wealthy merchants and officials. Accounts from redeemed captives, women who were eventually ransomed and returned to Europe, describe conditions that modern readers would immediately recognize as systematic abuse. These accounts were published in the 17th and 18th centuries, often by religious organizations raising money for ransoms, and they are among the most disturbing primary sources in European history. Maria ter Meetelen, a Dutch woman captured in 1731 and held for years before being ransomed, wrote a memoir that was published after her return. She described the constant psychological pressure, the lack of any privacy, and the explicit expectations placed on women kept in private households. Perhaps the most disturbing documented aspect of the Barbary trade was the demand for very young captives. Pre-teen and teenage girls commanded premium prices specifically because buyers intended to raise them within the household, acculturating them before they were old enough to resist. Historical documents from Algerian merchant records, studied by modern scholars, show pricing structures that explicitly tied higher values to younger age. This was not hidden, it was documented and systematic. Regarding forced conversion, women who converted to Islam, whether by choice or under sustained pressure, occupied a slightly different legal position, but conversion did not automatically guarantee freedom or protection. Many converted and remained enslaved. Many converted as a survival strategy, and many never converted and paid the price for it in harsher treatment. Women were not the only ones whose bodies were treated as property to be modified for market value. Male slaves destined for certain roles, particularly palace service, harem guardianship, or close domestic employment, were subject to a practice that was widespread, documented, and openly discussed in the historical record: castration. The creation of eunuchs was not a fringe practice, it was institutionalized. Eunuchs served as the trusted administrators of harems, spaces where uncastrated men were not permitted. They held positions of significant power within palace hierarchies precisely because their castration was seen as making them safe to exist in proximity to women. The operation itself was brutal and frequently fatal. Historian Ehud Toledano, who has extensively studied Ottoman slavery, notes that mortality rates from the procedure were high. Estimates from period sources suggest that a significant percentage of those subjected to it did not survive the immediate aftermath. Those who did survive occupied an ambiguous social position, sometimes rising to positions of genuine influence, sometimes spending their lives in invisible servitude. The boys and men subjected to this were not volunteers. They were enslaved people with no say over what was done to their bodies. This happened, it was documented, and it is almost never discussed in mainstream historical education. The Barbary slave system was not just morally catastrophic, it was economically sophisticated. There were multiple layers of profit. Layer 1. The raid. Corsair captains received a share of the value of the captives they brought back. The state received a portion. Investors who funded the voyages received returns. It was, in the coldest sense, a business. Layer 2. The ransom market. Many captives, particularly educated men or those with valuable skills, were never intended to be kept. They were held as leverage for ransom payments from their families, their communities, or their governments. The Catholic Church played a significant role in this economy through organizations called the Trinitarians and the Mercedarians, religious orders specifically founded in the medieval period to raise money and negotiate the release of Christian captives from Muslim slaveholders. These organizations raised enormous sums over centuries. They documented their negotiations meticulously, and their records are some of the richest sources we have for understanding what captives experienced. Layer 3. Tribute. European nations, including the young United States, paid annual tribute to the Barbary states in exchange for promises not to raid their ships. The U.S. paid this tribute for years after independence before finally sending the Navy to end it. The First Barbary War from 1801 to 1805. Thomas Jefferson decided that paying tribute was not a long-term solution. He was right. This is a question worth asking seriously. The Atlantic slave trade is taught extensively, and it should be. It was a massive, world-shaping atrocity that has ongoing consequences in the societies it created. But the Barbary slave trade, which enslaved over 1 million Europeans, lasted for 3 centuries and included some of the most extreme documented abuses in the historical record, is almost completely absent from standard curricula. Why? Several reasons, and they're worth examining honestly. First, the victims were European, and the dominant historical narrative in recent decades has focused, understandably, on non-European victims of European-inflicted violence. Placing European suffering at the center of a slavery discussion can feel, in this context, politically complicated. Second, the perpetrators were from Muslim-majority societies, and there is genuine discomfort in some academic and media circles about producing narratives that could be weaponized for anti-Muslim sentiment. Third, the abolitionist legacy of Britain and the United States, the first major powers to legally abolish the slave trade, tends to dominate Western historical memory, creating a narrative where the West is the site of slavery's sin and its remedy. Barbary slavery complicates that narrative, None of these are good reasons to ignore documented history. As the viewer comment that inspired this video put it, slavery was horrible regardless of who practiced it, but it should be taught in its full context. That's right, it should. History does not belong to any one narrative. The suffering of enslaved people, whether African, European, or from any other background, deserves honest documentation, honest teaching, and honest memory. The Barbary slave system did not end because the people running it had a change of heart. It ended because it was militarily destroyed. After the Napoleonic Wars, Britain, now the world's dominant naval power, and having recently abolished its own slave trade, turned its attention to the Barbary states. In 1816, Admiral Edward Pellew led a joint Anglo-Dutch fleet into the harbor of Algiers and bombarded it into submission. The Dey of Algiers was forced to sign a treaty releasing over 1,200 Christian slaves and renouncing the taking of Christian slaves permanently. France completed the process by invading and colonizing Algeria in 1830, ending the Barbary states as independent political entities. The slave trade that had operated for 3 centuries was finished, not through negotiation, not through moral persuasion, but through force. What you just heard is not a comfortable story. It's not supposed to be. History, real history, is not comfortable. It is not simple. It does not sort cleanly into heroes and villains who map neatly onto modern politics. The Barbary slave trade was a horror. The Atlantic slave trade was a horror. Slavery in all its forms, across all of human history, was a horror, practiced by nearly every civilization on Earth, and only abolished through sustained moral, legal, and military effort by a small number of societies in the 19th century. Understanding the full scope of that horror, without flinching, without filtering it to serve a preferred narrative, is the only way to actually honor those who suffered through it. If you want to know more about specific stories, individual captives, specific raids, the full account of the Icelandic abduction, or the economics of ransom, let us know in the comments. This is a subject that deserves full, serious treatment. Subscribe if you're new, leave your thoughts below, and remember, the past doesn't hide itself. We do.